Shakespeare's sonnets are typically written in iambic pentameter. An iamb is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. A stress or accent is the greater amount of force given to one syllable in speaking than is given to another. We favor a stressed syllable with a little more breath and emphasis. For example, consider the following words: eagle, open, impact, statue. You can hear that the stress is on the first syllable. Otherwise, eagle would be pronounced eagle, and open would be pronounced open. Note how the stresses fall differently on the following words: cigar, mystique, precise, until. Again, you can hear where the stress falls, in this case on the final syllable. Otherwise, cigar would be pronounced cigar, and until would be pronounced until. When we put two or three syllables together, one of which is stressed, we call that a metrical foot. Pentameter means 5 metric feet. So iambic pentameter is 5 feet of iambic meter, 2 syllables per foot, or 10 syllables total per line. We can find iambic pentameter most easily in Shakespeare's sonnets. A sonnet is a 14-line poem written in iambic pentameter. Shakespeare wrote his sonnets in 3 quatrains, rhyming A-B, A-B, C-D, C-D, E-F, E-F, and then a final couplet, G-G. Listen to both the meter and the rhyme in Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. When Shakespeare's 154 sonnets were published in Thomas Thorpe's 1609 edition, the vogue of the Elizabethan sonnet sequence had passed, and the sonnet form itself was suspect. However, up until the 1590s, the sonnet was often considered eloquence itself. Thus, it is likely that Shakespeare's sonnets were written much earlier, even decades before their publication. In fact, many sonnets give textual clues that they were written considerably earlier than 1609, when they were published. Sonnet writing up until the 1590s was a sophisticated game of courtiers. The challenge of the game was to sound as intimate, self-revealing, and emotionally vulnerable as possible without actually disclosing anything compromising to anyone outside the innermost circle. Sonnets that were too cautious were insipid and would only show the poet to be a bore. Sonnets that were too transparent could give moral offense. Shakespeare appears to be playing this game, for we know almost nothing about the historical circumstances under which Shakespeare wrote them. We don't know to whom they are addressed. We don't know exactly when they were written. We do know that they seem highly personal and confessional in nature. We also know that a love triangle is referenced in which Shakespeare's friend and his mistress betray him by having an affair together, but other sonnets seem completely unconnected. We should read Shakespeare's sonnets as an unauthorized, miscellaneous collection of poems, not a planned sequence of any kind. Recent scholarly work suggests that the sonnets are written to a variety of patrons, family members, and friends. In the past, scholars generally grouped Shakespeare's sonnets into 3 broad categories. Sonnets 1 through 126 were addressed to or concerned with a young man. Sonnets 127 through 152 were addressed to or concerned with a dark-haired lady. Sonnets 153 and 154 are translations of a 5th century Greek poem. However, it is unlikely that the first 126 sonnets are addressed to or about the same young man. For example, I would argue that Sonnet 33 may have been written about the death of Shakespeare's son, Hamnet. Furthermore, some scholars argue that not all of the first 126 sonnets may be addressed to a man at all. There are only a handful of sonnets in which the gender of the addressee is clearly revealed. Regardless, the idea of the young man or the youth is too generalized for most scholars today. Also overgeneralized is the idea of a dark lady, to whom supposedly all the sonnets of 127 through 152 are addressed. It's highly unlikely that all these are addressed to or about the same woman. For example, I would argue that Sonnet 145 is most likely addressed to Shakespeare's wife, Anne Hathaway, probably when they were still courting. The pun on Hathaway's name makes this transparent. It is likely one of the earliest sonnets that he wrote. Since this series of poems concludes with two of Shakespeare's worst poems ever written, it is highly unlikely that the poet approved of this publication. Most poets would have organized their poems in a sequence that climaxed with one or two of their best poems. Therefore, some have speculated that the sonnets were placed in reverse order. But Sonnets 1 and 2 are hardly his best sonnets either. Thus, we should view these sonnets as a collection rather than a sequence. The sonnets are not presented in any kind of chronological order. In Sonnets 1 through 17, a friend is urged to marry, yet in Sonnet 15, marriage is not mentioned at all. In Sonnet 77, Shakespeare speaks of giving his friend a book, and much later in Sonnet 122, he speaks of a similar gift. More importantly, feelings of happiness and devotion are mixed with others expressing grief and estrangement in a succession that makes no kind of emotional sense. Furthermore, the sonnets are not presented in any thematic order, such as love, betrayal, friendship, and estrangement. These are all intertwined. In the dedication page of the sonnets we read, "To the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H., all happiness and that eternity promised by our ever-living poet, wisheth the well-wishing adventurer in setting forth, T.T." The T.T. in the dedication is Thomas Thorpe, the publisher. The identity of Mr. W.H., however, is uncertain. Some have speculated that the W.H. is a printer error in fixing Shakespeare's initials, W.S., or perhaps W.S.H., and the S was dropped. That Shakespeare as the writer is the begetter of these sonnets. Or perhaps the begetter is the young man to whom Shakespeare addresses many of his sonnets, thus the begetter of the sonnets is the one who inspired them. Or perhaps Mr. W.H. is the person who secured the manuscript for the publisher, thus the begetter of the sonnets is the one who gave them to the publisher. At least 5 names have been forwarded as possible candidates. Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, to whom Shakespeare in the 1590s dedicated 2 long, elaborate poems, including Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece. However, the W and H would have had to be inverted. William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, one of the dedicatees of the first folio. William Hall, a printer who had worked with Thorpe on other publications. Or William Harvey, the stepfather of Henry Wriothesley, who could have obtained and then published the poems, although it is likely that Lord Burleigh, the ward of Henry Wriothesley, commissioned some of them, at least the ones encouraging the young man to marry. Henry Wriothesley, the 3rd Earl of Southampton, is, in my opinion, most likely the young man to whom many of the first 126 sonnets are addressed. The young Earl was an early patron of Shakespeare's, described in the 1590s as one who would, quote, pass the time in London, merely in going to plays every day, end quote. The young Earl was at age 18 the ward of Lord Burleigh. Henry Wriothesley's father had accused his wife of adultery, and through a nasty separation, she was forbidden to see her son. Then his father died, just shy of his 18th birthday, and his mother remarried William Harvey. Southampton then became a ward of Lord Burleigh until he was 21 years old. Burleigh, as a legal guardian, had the right to negotiate a marriage for the young earl, so that upon turning 21, if he declined to the match, he would be liable for damages to be paid to the family of the rejected party. Cunningly, Lord Burleigh proposed a match to his own granddaughter. Worsley refused the match, so Burleigh commissioned John Clapham to write a poem, Narcissus, as an artistic means of persuasion. The poem failing in its purpose, it is likely that Lord Burleigh noted that the young earl was excited by the talents of a promising young poet and playwright in London, and may have commissioned Shakespeare. The opening groups of Shakespeare's sonnets clearly address a self-willed young man who has refused to marry and is thus consuming himself in a single life. The young earl was, in fact, the young man to whom Shakespeare dedicated both Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece, writing in his dedication of the Rape of Lucrece, quote, "The love I dedicate to your lordship is without end. What I have done is yours. What I have to do is yours. Being part in all I have, devoted yours." End quote. Elizabethan dedicatory letters were usually quite florid, but this was not at all typical, not merely praising Southampton, but affirming a relationship with him that had unfolded over time, probably years. It is also important to note that Shakespeare's company performed Love's Labour Lost at the Earl's house upon request as a special performance. Furthermore, the young Earl, with others, instigated and paid handsomely for a performance of Richard II by Shakespeare's company on the eve of the Essex Rebellion, to put the people in London in mind of rebellion. The Earl of Southampton was imprisoned and nearly executed for his part in the rebellion against Queen Elizabeth in 1601. Elizabeth understood well the role that Shakespeare's play had in the rebellion. "I am Richard II," she fumed. "Know ye not that?" At least two of the key conspirators were questioned about Shakespeare's play as an integral part of their conspiracy. Since the sonnets addressing a young man speak of him as a lover and are very intimate and indeed passionate, many have speculated about Shakespeare's possible homosexuality. In fact, C.S. Lewis wrote that he found it hard to think of any real situation in which it, the love Shakespeare expresses, would be natural. Certainly, the feelings our poet describes for the young man indicate a very close friendship. This portrait of the Earl of Southampton, Henry Worsley, certainly depicts Shakespeare's friend as very effeminate. It, in fact, was not until the Victorian era that this painting was determined to be A, a man, and B, the Earl of Southampton. Shakespeare's sexuality can neither be proved nor disproved. However, the balance of probabilities discredits Shakespeare's homosexuality. Edmund Malone, 18th century editor of Shakespeare, wrote, "Such addresses to men, however indelicate, were customary in our author's time, and neither imported criminality nor were esteemed indecorous." A. Lytton Sells writes in The Italian Influence of English Poetry, quote, "The ardent friendship of one man for another, a friendship exempt from sexual passion, and the eulogy of one's friend's beauty were not uncommon in Renaissance Europe." End quote. The sonnets themselves also reveal the author's intent. Sonnet 20, although perhaps one of the most intimate of the series, makes a distinction between the emotional and intellectual love the author shares with this young man and the physical love shared with a woman. Sonnet 20 begins, "A woman's face, with nature's own hand painted, hast thou the master-mistress of my passion. A woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change as is false woman's fashion." Paraphrased, "You have a woman's face, you the object of my love. You have a woman's heart, but not as inconstant as is the case with the way women behave." The sonnet continues, "And I more bright than theirs, less false and rolling, gilding the object whereupon it gazeth, a man in hue all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes, and women's souls amazeth." Paraphrased, your eyes are brighter than theirs, without seeking out other lovers. Whatever you look upon is golden. You're a man who appears to control all forms, who steals men's eyes and amazes women's souls. To this point, the poem seems very passionate. We have an expression of love for another man who is called the master mistress of his passion. However, the sonnet continues, "And for woman wert thou first created, till nature as she wrought thee fell a-doting, and by addition me of thee defeated, by adding one thing, to my purpose nothing. But since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use their treasure." Paraphrased, and you were first created to be a woman, until nature, as she created you, fell in love with you, and by addition, by adding a phallus, denied me of having you, by adding one thing, your phallus, that does me no good. But since nature pricked you out for women's pleasure, my love is yours, and the expression of your love is their treasure. Clearly, the love Shakespeare bears for this young man is non-sexual, since nature pricked him out for women's pleasure, adding a phallus that for Shakespeare's purpose serves nothing. He admires his friend. He loves his friend. He even sees femininity in his friend. But the expression of his friend's love is women's treasure, not Shakespeare's. Other sonnets also reveal the author's intent in expressing love for his male friends. Shakespeare uses the phrase, "my lover's gone," in Sonnet 31 to reference all his dead friends, calling all his friends lovers. The young man is told in Sonnet 55 that since Shakespeare's sonnets will endure eternally, his friend will live in lovers' eyes, calling his future admirers lovers, meaning that we, the readers, are also lovers of the young man. Shakespeare speaks of the marriage of true minds in Sonnet 116, which is most likely addressed to a young man, while he speaks of lust in action in Sonnet 129, addressed to his mistress. Thus, one love is platonic and intellectual, the other very physical. Finally, it is clear from the sonnet collection that the same young man whom he encourages to marry has an affair with Shakespeare's mistress. Both Shakespeare and the young man are clearly engaged in heterosexual affairs. Let us now turn our attention to the Dark Lady. Who was the mistress to whom Shakespeare addresses many, if not most, of sonnets 127 through 152? Well, no one knows. Elizabeth Vernon, a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, is a possibility. She was married to Henry Worsley, Earl of Southampton, and their daughter was born 6 months later. Mary Fitton, another of the Queen's maids of honor, is a possibility. In a liaison with William Herbert, she produced a son. Herbert refused to marry her. She could be any number of unknown ladies of the tavern or town. What we do know about her is she had dark hair, she was musical, Shakespeare did not consider her beautiful, and she exercised an attraction on Shakespeare that filled him with humiliation, guilt, and even anguish. That the sonnets leave us with these unanswered questions is evidence that Shakespeare knew well how to play this sophisticated poetic game. His sonnets are as intimate, self-revealing, and emotionally vulnerable as possible without disclosing anything compromising to anyone outside his innermost circle. Being outside his innermost circle, we can only guess at the players, yet we can still enjoy the beauty of the imagery and the depth of the passion expressed.